Shalom. Welcome back to Sister for Sister Story Time. I am your host and sister historian, Shaya Loya. We are currently reading the book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, currently on the chapter titled The Mysteries and Their Emissaries. The link for purchasing the book is listed in the description box. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and donate to the channel. Did that divine knowledge, which constituted the supreme possession of the pagan priestcraft, survive the destruction of their temples? Is it yet accessible to mankind, or does it lie buried beneath the rubbish of ages, entombed within the very sanctuaries that were once illuminated by its splendor? In Egypt, writes Origen, the philosophers have a sublime and secret knowledge respecting the nature of God. What did Julian imply when he spoke of the secret initiations into the sacred mysteries of the seven-rayed God who lifted souls to salvation through his own nature? Who were the blessed theurgists who understood them profundities concerning which Julian dared not speak? If this inner doctrine were always concealed from the masses, for whom a simpler code had been devised, is it not highly probable that the exponents of every aspect of modern civilization, philosophic, ethical, religious, and scientific, are ignorant of the true meaning of the very theories and tenets on which their beliefs are founded? Do the arts and sciences that the race has inherited from older nations conceal beneath their fair exterior a mystery so great that only the most illumined intellect can grasp its import? Such is undoubtedly the case. Albert Pike, who has gathered ample evidence of the excellence of the doctrines promulgated by the mysteries, supports his assertions by quoting from the writings of Clement of Alexandria, Plato, Epictetus, Proclus, Aristophanes, and Cicero, all of whom unite in lauding the high ideals of these institutions. From the unqualified testimony of such reputable authorities, no reasonable doubt can exist that the initiates of Greece, Egypt, and other ancient countries possessed the correct solution to those great cultural, intellectual, moral, and social problems which, in an unsolved state, confront the humanity of the 20th century. The reader must not interpret this statement to mean that antiquity had foreseen and analyzed every complexity of this generation, but rather that the mysteries had evolved a method whereby the mind was so trained in the fundamental verities of life that it was able to cope intelligently with any emergency which might arise. Thus, the reasoning faculties were organized by a simple process of mental culture, for it was asserted that where reason reigns supreme, inconsistency cannot exist. Wisdom, it was maintained, lifts man to the condition of godhood, a fact which explains the enigmatical statement that the mysteries transformed roaring beasts into divinities. The preeminence of any philosophical system can be determined only by the excellence of its products. The mysteries have demonstrated the superiority of their culture by giving to the world minds of such overwhelming greatness, souls of such beatific vision, and lives of such outstanding impeccability that even after the lapse of ages, that the teachings of these individuals constitute the present spiritual, intellectual, and ethical standards of the race. The initiates of the various mystery schools of past ages form a veritable golden chain of supermen and superwomen connecting heaven and earth. They are the links of that Homeric golden chain with which Zeus boasted he could bind the several parts of the universe to the pinnacle of Olympus. The sons and daughters of Isis are indeed an illustrious line, founders of sciences and philosophies, patrons of arts and crafts, supporting by the transcendency of their divinely given power the structures of world religions erected to do them homage, founders of doctrines which have molded the lives of uncounted generations. These initiate teachers bear witness to that spiritual culture which has always existed and always will exist as a divine institution in the world of men. Those who represent an ideal beyond the comprehension of the masses must face the persecution of the unthinking multitude who are without that divine idealism which inspires progress and those rational faculties which unerringly sift through this falsehood. The lot of the initiate teacher is therefore almost invariably an unhappy one. Pythagoras crucified and his university burned, Hypatia torn from her chariot and rended limb from limb, Jacques de Molay, whose memory survives the consuming flame, Savonarola burned in the square of Florence, Galileo forced to recant upon bended knee, Giordano Bruno burned by the Inquisition, Roger Bacon compelled to carry on his experiments in the secrecy of his cell and leave his knowledge hidden under cipher, Dante Alighieri dying in exile from his beloved city, Francis Bacon patient under the burden of persecution, Cagliostro, the most vilified man of modern times. All this illustrious line bear unending witness of man's inhumanity to man. The world has ever been prone to heap plaudits upon its fools and calumny upon its thinkers. Here and there, notable exceptions occur, as in the case of the Comte de Saint Germain, a philosopher who survived his inquisitors and through the sheer transcendency of his genius won a position of comparative immunity. But even the illustrious Comte, whose illumined intellect merited the homage of the world, could not escape being branded an impostor, a charlatan, and an adventurer. From this long fist of immortal men and women who have represented the ancient wisdom before the world, three have been chosen as outstanding examples for more detailed consideration. The first, the most eminent woman philosopher of all ages. The second, the most maligned and persecuted man since the beginning of Christian era. The third, the most brilliant and the most successful modern exponent of this ancient wisdom. Hypatia, sitting in the chair of philosophy previously occupied by her father, Theon, the mathematician, the immortal Hypatia was for many years the central figure in the Alexandrian school of Neoplatonism. Famed alike for the depth of her learning and the charm of her person, beloved by the citizens of Alexandria and frequently consulted by the magistrates of that city, this noble woman stands out from the pages of history as the greatest of the pagan martyrs. A personal disciple of the magician Plutarch and versed in the profundities of the Platonic school, Hypatia eclipsed in argument and public esteem every proponent of the Christian doctrines in northern Egypt. While her writings perished at the time of the burning of the Library of Alexandria by the Mohammedans, some hint of their nature may be gleaned from the statements of contemporaneous authors. Hypatia evidently wrote a commentary on the arithmetic of Diophantus, another of the astronomical canon of Ptolemy, and a third of the conics of Apollonius of Perga. Synesius, bishop of Ptolemais, her devoted friend, wrote to Hypatia for assistance in the construction of an astrolabe and a hydroscope. Recognizing the transcendency of her intellect, the learned of many nations flocked to the academy where she lectured. The Table of Sieves. There is legend to the effect that the Tablet of Sieves, a dialogue between Sieves and Gerundio, was based upon an ancient table set in the temple of Kronos at Athens or Thebes, which depicted the entire progress of human life. The author of the Tablet of Sieves was a disciple of Socrates and lived about 390 BC. The world is represented as a great mountain. Out of the earth, at the base of it, come the myriads of human creatures who climb upward in search of truth and immortality. Above the clouds which conceal the summit of the mountain is the goal of human attainment, which is true happiness. The figures and groups are arranged as follows: 1. The door of the wall of life. 2. The genius or intelligence. 3. Deceit. 4. Opinions, desires, and pleasures. 5. Fortune. 6. The strong. 7. Venery, insatiability, flattery. 8. Sorrow. 9. Sadness. 10. Misery. 11. Grief. 12. Rage or despair. 13. The house of misfortune. 14. Penitence. 15. True opinion. 16. False opinion. 17. False doctrine. 18. Poets, orators, geometers, et al. Okay. 19, incontinence, sexual indulgence, and opinion. 20, the road of the true doctrine. 21, continence and patience. 22, the true doctrine. 23, truth and persuasion. 24, science and the virtues. 25, happiness. 26, the highest, first pleasure of the wise man. 27, the lazy and the strays. A number of writers have credited the teachings of Hypatia with being Christian in spirit. In fact, she removed the veil of mystery in which the new cult had enshrouded itself. Discoursing with such clarity upon it most involved principles that many newly converted to the Christian faith deserted it to become her disciples. Hypatia not only proved conclusively the pagan origin of the Christian faith, but also exposed and purported miracles then advanced by the Christians as tokens of divine preference by demonstrating the natural laws controlling the phenomena. At this time, Cyril, later to be renowned as the founder of the doctrine of the Christian Trinity and canonized for his zeal, was Bishop of Alexandria. Seeing in Hypatia a continual menace to the promulgation of the Christian faith, Cyril, indirectly at least, was the cause of her tragic end. Despite every later effort to exonerate him from the stigma of her murder, the incontrovertible fact remains that he made no effort to avert the foul and brutal crime. The only shred of excuse which might be offered in his defense is that, blinded by the spell of fanaticism, Cyril considered Hypatia to be a sorceress in league with the devil. In contrast to the otherwise general excellence of the literary works of Charles Kingsley, may be noted his puerile delineation of character of Hypatia in his book by that name. Without exception, the meager historical references to this virgin philosopher attest her virtue, integrity, and absolute devotion to the principles of truth and right. While it is true that the best minds of the Christianity of that period may readily be absolved from the charge of part- participis criminis, the implacable hatred of Cyril unquestionably communicated itself to the more fanatical members of his faith, particularly to a group of monks from the Nitrian desert. Led by Peter the Reader, a savage and illiterate man, they attacked Hypatia on the open street as she was passing from the academy to her home. Dragging the defenseless woman from her chariot, they took her to the Caesarean church. Tearing away her garments, they pounded her to death with clubs, after which they scraped the flesh from her bones with oyster shells and carried the mutilated remains to a place called Cindron, where they burned them to ashes. Thus perished in AD 415 the greatest woman initiate of the ancient world, and with her fell also the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria. The memory of Hypatia has probably been perpetuated in the hagiolatry of the Roman Catholic Church in the person of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. The Comte de Cagliostro. The divine Cagliostro, one moment the idol of Paris, the next a lonely prisoner in a dungeon of the Inquisition, passed like a meteor across the face of France. According to his memoirs written by him during his confinement in the Bastille, Alessandro Cagliostro was born in Malta of a noble but unknown family. He was reared and educated in Arabia under the tutelage of Altitas, a man well versed in several branches of philosophy and science, and also a master of the transcendental arts. While Cagliostro's biographers generally ridiculed this account, they utterly failed to advance in its stead any logical solution for the source of his magnificent store of arcane knowledge. Branded as an impostor and a charlatan, his miracles declared to be legerdemain, and his very generosity suspected of an ulterior motive. The Comte de Cagliostro is undoubtedly the most calumniated man in modern history. The mistrust, writes W.H.K. Trowbridge, that mystery and magic always inspire made Cagliostro, with his fantastic personality, an easy target for calumny. After having been riddled with abuse till he was unrecognizable, prejudice, the foster child of calumny, proceeded to lynch him, so to speak. For over 100 years, his character has dangled on the gibbet of infamy, upon which the sbirri of tradition have inscribed a curse on anyone who shall attempt to cut him down. His fate has been his fame. He is remembered in history not so much for anything he did as for what was done to him. The divine Cagliostro. The Comte de Cagliostro is described as a man not overly tall, but square-shouldered and deep of chest. His head, which was large, was abundantly covered with black hair, combed back from his broad and noble forehead. His eyes were black and very brilliant, and when he spoke with great feeling upon some profound subject, the pupils dilated, his eyebrows rose, and he shook his head like a maned lion. His hands and feet were small, an indication of noble birth, and his whole bearing was one of dignity and studiousness. He was filled with energy and could accomplish a prodigious amount of work. He dressed somewhat fantastically, gave so freely from an inexhaustible purse that he received the title of Father of the Poor, accepted nothing from anyone, and maintained himself in magnificence in a combined temple and palace in the Rue de la Sordière. According to his own statement, he was initiated into the mysteries by none other than the Comte de Saint-Germain. He had traveled through all parts of the world, and in the ruins of ancient Babylon and Nineveh had discovered wise men who understood all the secrets of human life. According to popular belief, Cagliostro's real name was Giuseppe Balsamo, and he was a Sicilian by birth. Within recent years, however, doubts have arisen as to whether this belief is in accord with the facts. It may yet be proved that in part at least the tirades of abuse heaped upon the unfortunate Comte have been directed against the wrong man. Giuseppe Balsamo was born in 1743 of honest but humble parentage. From boyhood, he exhibited selfish, worthless, and even criminal tendencies, and after a series of escapades, disappeared. Trowbridge presents ample proof that Cagliostro was not Giuseppe Balsamo, thus disposing of the worst accusation against him. After 6 months' imprisonment in the Bastille on his trial, Cagliostro was exonerated from any implication in the theft of the famous Queen's necklace, and later the fact was established that he had actually warned Cardinal de Rohan of the intended crime. Despite the fact, however, that he was discharged as innocent by the French trial court, a deliberate effort to vilify Cagliostro was made by an artist, more talented than intelligent, who painted a picture showing him holding the fatal necklace in his hand. The trial of Cagliostro has been called the prologue of the French Revolution. The smoldering animosity against Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, engendered by this trial, later burst forth as the Holocaust of the Reign of Terror. In his brochure, Cagliostro and His Egyptian Rite of Freemasonry, Henry R. Evans also ably defends this much persecuted man against the infamies so unjustly linked with his name. Sincere investigators of the facts surrounding the life and mysterious death of Cagliostro are of the opinion that the stories circulated against him may be traced to the machinations of the Inquisition, which in this manner sought to justify his persecution. The basic charge against Cagliostro was that he had attempted to found a Masonic lodge in Rome, nothing more. All other accusations are of subsequent date. For some reason undisclosed, the Pope commuted Cagliostro's sentence of death to perpetual imprisonment. This act in itself showed the regard in which Cagliostro was held even by his enemies. While his death is believed to have occurred several years later in an inquisitional dungeon in the castle of San Leo, it is highly improbable that such was the case. There are rumors that he escaped, and according to one very significant story, Cagliostro fled to India, where his talents received the appreciation denied them in politics-ridden Europe. After creating his Egyptian rite, Cagliostro declared that since women had been admitted into the ancient mysteries, there was no reason why they should be excluded from the modern orders. The Princess de Lamballe graciously accepted the dignity of Mistress of Honor in his secret society, and on the evening of her initiation, the most important members of the French court were present. The brilliance of the affair attracted the attention of the Masonic lodges in Paris. Their representatives, in a sincere desire to understand the Masonic mysteries, chose the learned Orientalist Court de Gebelin as their spokesman and invited Comte de Cagliostro to attend a conference to assist in clearing up a number of important questions concerning Masonic philosophy. The Comte accepted the invitation. On May 10, 1785, Cagliostro attended the conference called for that purpose, and his power and simplicity immediately won for him the favorable opinion of the entire gathering. It took but a few words for the court de Gebelin to discover that he was talking nor only to a fellow scholar, but to a man infinitely his superior. Cagliostro immediately presented an address which was so unexpected, so totally different from anything ever heard before by those assembled, that all were speechless with amazement. Cagliostro declared the Rose Cross to be the ancient and true symbol of the mysteries, and after a brief description of its original symbolism, branched out into a consideration of the symbolic meaning of letters, predicting to the assembly the future of France in a graphic manner that left no room for doubt that the speaker was a man of insight and supernatural power. With a curious arrangement of the letters of the alphabet, Cagliostro foretold in detail the horrors of the coming revolution and the fall of the monarchy, describing minutely the fate of the various members of the royal family. He also prophesied the advent of Napoleon and the rise of the First Empire. All this he did to demonstrate that which can be accomplished by superior knowledge. Later, when arrested and sent to the Bastille, Cagliostro wrote on the wall of his cell the following cryptic message, which, when interpreted, reads, "In 1789, the besieged Bastille will, on July 14th, be pulled down by you from top to bottom." Cagliostro was the mysterious agent of the Knights Templars, the Rosicrucian initiate whose magnificent store of learning is attested by the profundity of the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry. Thus, Comte de Cagliostro remains one of the strangest characters in history, believed by his friends to have lived forever and to have taken part in the marriage feast of Cana, and accused by his enemies of being the devil incarnate. His powers of prophecy are ably described by Alexandre Dumas in The Queen's Necklace. The world he sought to serve in his own strange way received him not, but has followed with relentless persecution down through the centuries, even the very memory of this illustrious adept who, unable to accomplish the great labor at hand, stepped aside in favor of his more successful compatriot, the Comte de Saint-Germain. During the early part of the 18th century, there appeared in the diplomatic circles of Europe the most baffling personality of history, a man whose life was so near a synonym of mystery that the enigma of his true identity was as insolvable to his contemporaries as it has been to later investigators. The Comte de Saint-Germain was recognized as the outstanding scholar and linguist of his day. His versatile accomplishments extended from chemistry and history to poetry and music. He played several musical instruments with great skill, and among his numerous compositions was a short opera. He was also an artist of rare ability, and the remarkably luminous effects which he created on canvas are believed to have been the result of his mixing powdered mother of pearl with his pigments. He gained worldwide distinction for his ability to reproduce in his paintings the original luster of the precious stones appearing upon the costumes of his subjects. His linguistic proficiency verged on the supernatural. He spoke German, English, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, French, with a Piedmontese accent, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Chinese with such fluency that in every land he visited, he was accepted as a native. He was ambidextrous to such a degree that he could write the same article with both hands simultaneously. When the two pieces of paper were afterwards placed together with a light behind them, the writing on one sheet exactly covered, letter for letter, the writing on the other. Prince Rogowski of Transylvania, Comte de Saint Germain. The great mysteries adept who termed himself the Comte de Saint Germain is generally supposed to have been born in 1710, but while the church register of Eckernford contains a record of his death in 1784, he was seen upon several occasions subsequent to that date, having attended a Masonic conference in 1785 and in Venice in 1788. The last historical mention Saint Germain was in 1822, at which time he was on the eve of embarking for India. As a historian, the Comte de Saint Germain possessed uncanny knowledge of every occurrence of the preceding 2,000 years, and in his reminiscence, he described in intimate detail events of previous centuries in which he had played important roles. He assisted Mesmer in developing the theory of mesmerism, and in all probability was the actual discoverer of that science. His knowledge of chemistry was so profound that he could remove flaws from diamonds and other precious stones, a feat which he actually performed at the request of Louis XV in 1757. He was also recognized as an art critic without a peer and was often consulted regarding paintings accredited it to the great masters. His claim to the possession of the fabled elixir of life was home witnessed to by Madame de Pompadour, who she declared that he had presented a lady of the court with a certain priceless liquid which had the effect of preserving her youthful vivacity and beauty for over 25 years beyond the normal term. The startling accuracy of his prophetic utterances gained for him no small degree of fame. To Marie Antoinette, he predicted the fall of the French monarchy, and he was also aware of the unhappy fate of the royal family years before the revolution actually took place. The crowning evidence, however, of the Comte's genius was his penetrating grasp of the political situation of Europe and the consummate skill with which he parried the thrust of his diplomatic adversaries. He was employed by a number of European governments, including the French, as a secret agent, and at all times bore credentials which gave him entry to the most exclusive circles. In her excellent monograph, The Comte de Saint Germain, The Secret of Kings, Mrs. Cooper Oakley lists the most important names under which the amazing person masqueraded between the years 1710 and 1822. During this time, she writes, we have M. de Saint Germain as the Marquis de Montferrat, Comte Bellamar or Aymar at Venice, Chevalier Schoening at Pisa, Chevalier Weldon at Milan and Leipzig, Comte Saltikoff at Genoa and Leghorn, Graf Sargi at Schwalbach and Treisdorf, Prince Ragussi at Dresden, and Comte de Saint Germain at Paris, The Hague, London, and St. Petersburg. It is evident that M.D. Saint Germain adopted these various names in the interest of the political Secret Service work, which historians have presumed to be the major mission of his life. The Comte de Saint Germain has been described as of medium height, well proportioned in body, and of regular and pleasing features. His complexion was somewhat swarthy and his hair dark, though often shown powdered. He dressed simply, usually in black, but his clothes were well fitting and of the best quality. He had apparently a mania for diamonds, which he wore not only in rings, but also in his watch and chain, his snuff box, and upon his buckles. A jeweler once estimated the value of his shoe buckles at 200,000 francs. The Comte is generally depicted as a man in middle life, entirely devoid of wrinkles and free from any physical infirmity. He ate no meat and drank no wine, in fact, seldom dined in the presence of any second person. Although he was looked upon as a charlatan and impostor by a few nobles at the French court, Louis XV severely reprimanded a courtier who made a disparaging remark concerning him. The grace and dignity that characterized his conduct, together with his perfect control of every situation, attested the innate refinement and culture of one to the manner born. This remarkable person also had the surprising and impressive ability to divine, even to the most minute details, the questions of his inquisitors before they were asked. By something akin to telepathy, he was also able to feel when his presence was needed in some distant city or state, and it has even been recorded of him that he had the astonishing habit not only of appearing in his own apartment and in those of friends without resorting to the conventionality of the door, but also of departing there from in a similar manner. M. de Saint Germain's travels covered many countries. During the reign of Peter III, he was in Russia, and between the years 1737 and 1742 in the court of Shah of Persia as an honored guest. On the subject of his wanderings, Una Birch writes, the travels of the Comte de Saint Germain covered a long period of years and a great range of countries. From Persia to France and from Calcutta to Rome, he was known and respected. Horace Walpole spoke with him in London in 1745. Clive knew him in India in 1756. Madame de Ademar alleges that she met him in Paris in 1789, 5 years after his supposed death, while other persons pretend to have held conversations with him in the early 19th century. He was on familiar and intimate terms with the crowned heads of Europe and the honored friend of many distinguished persons of all nationalities. He is even mentioned in the memoirs and letters of the day, and always as a man of mystery. Frederick the Great, Voltaire, Madame de Pompadour, Rousseau, Chatham, and Walpole, all of whom knew him personally, rivaled each other in curiosity as to his origin. During the many decades in which he was before the world, however, no one succeeded in discovering why he appeared as a Jacobite agent in London, as a conspirator in Petersburg, as an alchemist and connoisseur of pictures in Paris, or as a Russian general at Naples. Now and again, the curtain which shrouds his actions is drawn aside, and we are permitted to see him fiddling in the music room at Versailles, gossiping with Horace Walpole in London, sitting in Frederick the Great's library at Berlin, or conducting illuminous meetings in caverns by the Rhine. The Comte de Saint Germain has been generally regarded as an important figure in early activities of the Freemasons. Repeated efforts, however, probably with an ulterior motive, have been made to discredit his Masonic affiliations. An example of this is the account appearing in The Secret Tradition in Freemasonry by Arthur Edward Waite. This author, after making several rather disparaging remarks on the subject, amplifies his article by reproducing an engraving of the wrong Comte de Saint Germain, apparently being unable to distinguish between the great Illuminist and the French general. It will yet be established beyond all doubt that the Comte de Saint Germain was both a Mason and a Templar. In fact, the memoirs of Cagliostro contain a direct statement of his initiation into the order of the Knights Templars at the hands of Saint Germain. Many of the illustrious personages which with whom the Comte de Saint Germain associated were high Masons, and sufficient memoranda have been preserved concerning the discussions which they held to prove that he was a master of Freemasonic lore. It is also reasonably certain that he was connected with the Rosicrucians, possibly having been the actual head of that order. The Comte de Saint Germain was thoroughly conversant with the principles of Oriental esotericism. He practiced the Eastern system of meditation and concentration upon several occasions, having been seen seated with his feet crossed and hands folded in the posture of a Hindu Buddha. He had a retreat in the heart of the Himalayas to which he retired periodically from the world. On one occasion, he declared that he would remain in India for 85 years and then would return to the scene of his European labors. At various times, he admitted that he was obeying the orders of a power higher and greater than himself. What he did not say was that this superior power was the mystery school which had sent him into the world to accomplish a definite mission. The Comte de Saint Germain and Sir Francis Bacon are the two greatest emissaries sent into the world by the secret brotherhood in the last 1,000 years. E. Francis Utney, a theosophical writer, is of the belief that the Comte de Saint Germain was not the son of Prince Rakoczy of Transylvania, but because of his age could have been none other than the prince himself, who was known to be of a deep philosophic and mystic nature. The same writer believes the Comte de Saint Germain passed through the philosophic death as Francis Bacon in 1626, as Francois Rakoczy in 1735, and as Comte de Saint Germain in 1784. He also feels that the Comte de Saint Germain was the famous Comte de Gabalis, and as Count Hompesch was the last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. It is well known that many members of the European secret societies have feigned death for various purposes. Marshall Ney, a member of the Society of Unknown Philosophers, escaped the firing squad and under the name of Peter Stewart Ney lived and taught school for over 30 years in North Carolina. On his deathbed, P.S. Ney told Dr. Locke, the attending physician, that he was Marshal Ney of France. In concluding an article on the identity of the inscrutable Comte de Saint Germain, Andrew Lang writes, "Did Saint Germain really die in the palace of Prince Charles of Hesse about 1780 to 85? Did he, on the other hand, escape from the French prison where Grossley thought he saw him during the French Revolution? Was he known to Lord Lytton about 1860? Is he the mysterious Muscovite advisor of the Dalai Lama? Who knows? He is a will-o'-the-wisp of the memoir writers of the 18th century." Episodes from American history. Many times the question has been asked, was Francis Bacon's vision of the New Atlantis a prophetic dream of the great civilization which was so soon to rise upon the soil of the New World? It cannot be doubted that the secret societies of Europe conspired to establish upon the American continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Two incidents in the early history of the United States evidence the influence of that silent body, which has so long guided the destinies of peoples and religions. By them, nations are created as vehicles for the promulgation of ideals, and while nations are true to these ideals, they survive. When they vary from them, they vanish like the Atlantis of old, which had ceased to know the gods. In his admirable little treatise, Our Flag, Robert Allen Campbell revives the details of an obscure but most important episode of American history, the designing of the colonial flag of 1775. The account involves a mysterious man concerning whom no information is available other than that he was on familiar terms with both General George Washington and Dr. Benjamin Franklin. The following description of him is taken from Campbell's treatise. Little seems to have been known concerning this old gentleman, and in the materials from which this account is compiled, his name is not even once mentioned, for he is uniformly spoken of or referred to as the professor. He was evidently far beyond his 70 and he often referred to historical events of more than a century previous, just as if he had been a living witness of their occurrence. Still, he was erect, vigorous, and active, hale, hearty, and clear minded, as strong and energetic every way as in the prime of his life. He was tall, of fine figure, perfectly easy, and very dignified in his manners, being at once courteous, gracious, and commanding. He was, for those times and considering the customs of the colonists, very peculiar in his method of living, for he ate no flesh, fowl, or fish. He never used for food any green thing, any roots, or anything unripe. He drank no liquor, wine, or ale, but confined his diet to cereals and their products, fruits that were ripened on the stem in the sun, nuts, mild tea, and the sweets of honey, sugar, or molasses. He was well educated, highly cultivated, of extensive and well as varied information, and very studious. He spent considerable of his time in the patient and persistent conning of a number of very rare old books and ancient manuscripts, which he seemed to be deciphering, translating, or rewriting. These books and manuscripts, together with his own writings, he never showed to anyone, and he did not even mention them in his conversations with the family, except in the most casual way. And he always locked them up carefully in a large, old-fashioned, cubically shaped, iron-bound, heavy oaken chest whenever he left his room, even for his meals. He took long and frequent walks alone, sat on the brows of the neighboring hills, or mused in the midst of the green and flower-gemmed meadows. He was fairly liberal, but in no way lavish in spending his money, with which he was well supplied. He was a quiet, though a very genial and very interesting member of the family, and he was seemingly at home upon any and every topic coming up in conversation. He was, in short, one whom everyone would notice and respect, whom few would feel well acquainted with, and whom no one would presume to question concerning himself as to whence he came, why he tarried, or whither he journeyed. By something more than a mere coincidence, the committee appointed by the Colonial Congress to design a flag accepted an invitation to be guests while in Cambridge of the same family with which the professor was staying. It was here that General Washington joined them for the purpose of deciding upon a fitting emblem. By the signs which passed between them, it was evident that both General Washington and Dr. Franklin recognized the professor, and by unanimous approval, he was invited to become an active member of the committee. During the proceedings which followed, the professor was treated with the most profound respect, and all of his suggestions immediately acted upon. He submitted a pattern which he considered symbolically appropriate for the new flag, and this was unhesitatingly accepted by the other 6 members of the committee, who voted that the arrangement suggested by the professor be forthwith adopted. After the episode of the flag, the professor quietly vanished, and nothing further is known concerning him. Did General Washington and Dr. Franklin recognize the professor as an emissary of the mystery school, which has so long controlled the political destinies of this planet? Benjamin Franklin was a philosopher and a Freemason, possibly a Rosicrucian initiate. He and the Marquis de Lafayette, also a man of mystery, constitute 2 of the most important links in the chain of circumstance that culminated in the establishment of the original 13 American colonies as a free and independent nation. Dr. Franklin's philosophic attainments are well attested in Poor Richard's Almanac, published by him for many years under the name of Richard Saunders. His interest in the cause of Freemasonry is also shown by his republication of Anderson's Constitutions of Freemasonry, a rare and much disputed work on the subject. It was during the evening of July 4th, 1776, that the second of these mysterious episodes occurred. In the old State House in Philadelphia, a group of men were gathered for the momentous task of severing the last tie between the old country and the new. It was a grave moment, and not a few of those present feared that their lives would be the forfeit for their audacity. In the midst of the debate, a fierce voice rang out. The debaters stopped and turned to look upon the stranger, who was this thin man who had suddenly appeared in their midst and transfixed them with his oratory. They had never seen him before. None knew when he had entered, but his tall form and pale face filled them with awe. His voice ringing with a holy zeal, the stranger stirred them to their very souls. His closing words rang through the building: God has given America to be free. As the stranger sank into a chair exhausted, a wild enthusiasm burst forth. Name after name was placed upon the parchment. The Declaration of Independence was signed. But where was the man who had precipitated the accomplishment of this immortal task, who had lifted for a moment the veil from the eyes of the assemblage and revealed to them a part at least of the great purpose for which the new nation was conceived? He had disappeared, nor was he ever seen again or his identity established. This episode parallels others of a similar kind recorded by ancient historians attendant upon the founding of every new nation. Are they coincidences, or do they demonstrate that the divine wisdom of the ancient mysteries still is present in the world, serving mankind as it did of old? And the conclusion: Philip, king of Macedon, ambitious to obtain the teacher who would be most capable of imparting the higher branches of learning to his 14-year-old son Alexander, and wishing the prince to have for his mentor the most famous and learned of the great philosophers, decided to communicate with Aristotle. He dispatched the following letter to the Greek sage: Philip to Aristotle, health. Know that I have a son. I render the gods many thanks, not so much for his birth as that he was born in your time, for I hope that being educated and instructed by you, he will become worthy of us both and the kingdom which he shall inherit. Accepting Philip's invitation, Aristotle journeyed to Macedon in the fourth year of the 108th Olympiad and remained for 8 years as the tutor of Alexander. The young prince's affection for his instructor became as great as that which he felt for his father. He said that his father had given him being, but that Aristotle had given him well-being. The basic principles of the ancient wisdom were imparted to Alexander by the great Aristotle, and at the philosopher's feet, the Macedonian youth came to realize the transcendency of Greek learning as it was personified in Plato's immortal disciple. Elevated by his illumined teacher to the threshold of the philosophic sphere, he beheld the world of the sages, the world that fate and the limitations of his own soul decreed he should not conquer. Aristotle, in his leisure hours, edited and annotated the Iliad of Homer and presented the finished volume to Alexander. This book the young conqueror so highly prized that he carried it with him on all his campaigns. At the time of his triumph over Darius, discovering among the spoils a magnificent gem-studded casket of unguents, he dumped its contents upon the ground, declaring that at last he had found a case worthy of Aristotle's edition of the Iliad. While on his Asiatic campaign, Alexander learned that Aristotle had published one of his most prized discourses, an occurrence which deeply grieved the young king. So too Aristotle, conqueror of the unknown, Alexander, conqueror of the known, sent this reproachful and pathetic admission of the insufficiency of worldly pomp and power. Alexander to Aristotle, help. You were wrong in publishing those branches of science hitherto not to be acquired except from oral instruction. In what shall I excel others if the more profound knowledge I gain from you be communicated to all? For my part, I had rather surpassed the majority of mankind in the sublimer branches of learning than in extent of power and dominion. Farewell. The receipt of this amazing letter caused no ripple in the placid life of Aristotle, who replied that although the discourse had been communicated to the multitudes, none who had not heard him deliver the lecture, who lacked spiritual comprehension, could understand its true import. A few short years, and Alexander the Great went the way of all flesh, and with his body crumbled the structure of empire erected upon his personality. 1 year later, Aristotle also passed into that greater world concerning whose mysteries he had so often discoursed with his disciples in the Lyceum. But as Aristotle excelled Alexander in life, so he excelled him in death. For though his body moldered in an obscure tomb, the great philosopher continued to live in his intellectual achievements. Age after age paid him grateful tribute. Generation after generation pondered over his theorems until, by the sheer transcendency of his rational faculties, Aristotle, the master of those who know, as Dante has called him, became the actual conqueror of the very world which Alexander had sought to subdue with the sword. Thus, it is demonstrated that to capture a man, it is not sufficient to enslave his body. It is necessary to enlist his reason. That to free a man, it is not enough to strike the shackles from his limbs. His mind must be liberated from bondage to his own ignorance. Physical conquest must ever fail, for generating hatred and dissension, it spurs the mind to the avenging of an outraged body. But all men are bound, whether willingly or unwillingly, to obey that intellect in which they recognize qualities and virtues superior to their own. That the philosophic culture of ancient Greece, Egypt, and India excelled that of the modern world must be admitted by all, even by the most confirmed of modernists. The golden era of Greek aesthetics, intellectualism, and ethics has never since been equaled. The true philosopher belongs to the most noble order of men. The nation or race which is blessed by possession of illumined thinkers is fortunate indeed, and its name shall be remembered for their sake. In the famous Pythagorean school of Crotona, philosophy was regarded as indispensable to the life of man. He who did not comprehend the dignity of the reasoning power could not properly be said to live. Therefore, when through innate perverseness a member either voluntarily withdrew or was forcibly ejected from the philosophic fraternity, a headstone was set up for him in the community graveyard. For he who had forsaken intellectual and ethical pursuits to re enter the material sphere with its illusions of sense and false ambition was regarded as one dead to the sphere of reality. The life represented by the thraldom of the senses, the Pythagoreans conceived to be spiritual death, while they regarded death to the sense world as spiritual life. Philosophy bestows life in that it reveals the dignity and purpose of living. Materiality bestows death in that it benumbs or clouds those faculties of the human soul which should be responsive to the enlivening impulses of creative thought and ennobling virtue. How inferior to these standards of remote days are the laws by which men live in the 20th century. Today, man, a sublime creature with infinite capacity for self improvement, in an effort to be true to false standards, turns from his birthright of understanding without realizing the consequences and plunges into the maelstrom of material illusion. The precious span of his earthly years he devotes to the pathetically futile effort to establish himself as an enduring power in a realm of unenduring things. Gradually, the memory of his life as a spiritual being vanishes from his objective mind, and he focuses all his partly awakened faculties upon the seething beehive of industry, which he has come to consider the sole actuality. From the lofty heights of his selfhood, he slowly sinks into the gloomy depths of ephemerality. He falls to the level of the beast and in brutish fashion mumbles the problems arising from his all too insufficient knowledge of the divine plan. Here, in the lurid turmoil of a great industrial, political, commercial inferno, men writhe in self inflicted agony and, reaching out into the swirling mist, strive to clutch and hold the grotesque phantoms and success and power. John and the Vision of the Apocalypse, from an engraving by Jean Duvet. Jean Duvet of Langres, who was born in 1485 and presumably died sometime after 1561, the year in which his illustrations to the Apocalypse were printed in book form, was the oldest and greatest of French Renaissance engravers. Little is known concerning Duvet beyond the fact that he was the goldsmith to the King of France. His engravings for the Book of Revelation, executed after he had passed his 70th year, were his masterpiece. For further information regarding this obscure master, consult article by William M. Ivins, Jr., The Arts, of May 1926. The face of John is an actual portrait of Duvet. This plate, like many others cut by Duvet, is rich in philosophical symbolism. Ignorant of the cause of life, ignorant of the purpose of life, ignorant of what lies beyond the mystery of death, yet possessing within himself the answer to it all, man is willing to sacrifice the beautiful, the true, and the good within and without upon the blood-stained altar of worldly ambition. The world of philosophy, that beautiful garden of thought wherein the sages dwell in the bond of fraternity, fades from view. In its place rises an empire of stone, steel, smoke, and hate, a world in which millions of creatures, potentially human, scurry to and fro in the desperate effort to exist and at the same time maintain the vast institution which they have erected and which, like some mighty juggernaut, is rumbling inevitably towards an unknown end. In this physical empire which man erects in the vain belief that he can outshine the kingdom of the celestials, everything is changed to stone. Fascinated by the glitter of gain, man gazes at the Medusa-like face of greed and stands petrified. In this commercial age, science is concerned solely with the classification of physical knowledge and investigation of the temporal and illusionary parts of nature. Its so-called practical discoveries bind man, but more tightly with the bonds of physical limitation. Religion, too, has become materialistic. The beauty and dignity of faith is measured by huge piles of masonry, by tracts of real estate, or by the balance sheet. Philosophy, which connects heaven and earth like a mighty ladder, up the rungs of which the illumined of all ages have climbed into the living presence of reality. Even philosophy has become a prosaic and heterogeneous mass of conflicting notions. Its beauty, its dignity, its transcendency are no more. Like other branches of human thought, it has been made materialistic, practical, and its activities so directionalized that they may also contribute their part to the erection of this modern world of stone and steel. In the ranks of the so-called learned, there is rising up a new order of thinkers, which may best be termed the school of the worldly wise men. After arriving at the astounding conclusion that they are the intellectual salt of the earth, these gentlemen of letters have appointed themselves the final judges of all knowledge, both human and divine. This group affirms that all mystics must have been epileptic and most of the saints neurotic. It declares God to be a fabrication of primitive superstition, the universe to be intended for no particular purpose, immortality to be a figment of the imagination, and an outstanding individuality to be but a fortuitous combination of cells. Pythagoras is asserted to have suffered from a bean complex. Socrates was a notorious inebriate. St. Paul was subject to fits. Paracelsus was an infamous quack, the Comte de Cagliostro, a mountebank, and the Comte de Saint Germain, the outstanding crook of history. What do the lofty concepts of the world's illumined saviors and sages have in common with these stunted, distorted products of the realism of this century? All over the world, men and women ground down by the soulless cultural systems of today are crying out for the return of the banished age of beauty and enlightenment, for something practical in the highest sense of the word. A few are beginning to realize that the so called civilization in its present form is at the vanishing point, that coldness, heartlessness, commercialism, and material efficiency are impractical, and only that which offers opportunity for the expression of love and ideality is truly worthwhile. All the world is seeking happiness, but knows not in what direction to search. Men must learn that happiness crowns the soul's quest for understanding. Only through the realization of infinite goodness and infinite accomplishment can the peace of the inner self be assured. In spite of man's geocentrism, there is something in the human mind that is reaching out to philosophy, not to this or that philosophic code, but simply to philosophy in the broadest and fullest sense. The great philosophic institution of the past must rise again, for these alone can tend the veil which divides the world of causes from that of effects. Only the mysteries, those sacred colleges of wisdom, can reveal to struggling humanity that greater and more glorious universe, which is the true home of the spiritual being called man. Modern philosophy has failed in that it has come to regard thinking as simply an intellectual process. Materialistic thought is as hopeless a code of life as commercialism itself. The power to think true is the savior of humanity. The mythological and historical redeemers of every age were all personifications of that power. He who has a little more rationality than his neighbor is a little better than his neighbor. He who functions on a higher plane of rationality than the rest of the world is termed the greatest thinker. He who functions on a lower plane is regarded as a barbarian. Thus, comparative rational development is the true gauge of the individual's evolutionary status. Briefly stated, the true purpose of ancient philosophy was to discover a method whereby development of the rational nature could be accelerated instead of awaiting the slower processes of nature. This supreme source of power, this attainment of knowledge, this unfolding of the God within is concealed under the epigrammatic statement of the philosophic life. This was the key to the great work, the mystery of the philosopher's stone, for it meant that alchemical transmutation had been accomplished. Thus, ancient philosophy was primarily the living of a life, secondarily, an intellectual method. He alone can become a philosopher in the highest sense who lives the philosophic life. What man lives, he comes to know. Consequently, a great philosopher is one whose threefold life, physical, mental, and spiritual, is wholly devoted to and completely permeated by his rationality. Man's physical, emotional, and mental natures provide environments of reciprocal benefit or detriment to each other. Since the physical nature is the immediate environment of the mental, only that mind is capable of rational thinking, which is enthroned in a harmonious and highly refined material constitution. Hence, right action, right feeling, and right thinking are prerequisites of right knowing, and the attainment of philosophical power is possible only to such as have harmonized their thinking with their living. The wise have therefore declared that none can attain to the highest in the science of knowing until first he has attained to the highest in the science of living. Philosophic power is the natural outgrowth of the philosophic life. Just as an intense physical existence emphasizes the importance of physical things, or just as the monastic metaphysical asceticism establishes the desirability of the ecstatic state. So complete philosophic absorption ushers the consciousness of the thinker into the most elevated and noble of all spheres, the pure philosophic or rational world. In a civilization primarily concerned with the accomplishment of the extremes of temporal activity, the philosopher represents an equilibrating intellect capable of estimating and guiding the cultural growth. The establishment of the philosophic rhythm in the nature of an individual ordinarily requires from 15 to 20 years. During that entire period, the disciples of old were constantly subjected to the most severe discipline. Every activity of life was gradually disengaged from other interests and focalized upon the reasoning part. In the ancient world, there was another and most vital factor which entered into the production of rational intellects and which is entirely beyond the comprehension of modern thinkers, namely, invitation into the philosophic mysteries. A man who had demonstrated his peculiar mental and spiritual fitness was accepted into the body of the learned, and to him was revealed that priceless heritage of arcane lore preserved from generation to generation. This heritage of philosophic truth is the matchless treasure of all ages, and each disciple admitted into these brotherhoods of the wise made, in turn, his individual contribution to this store of classified knowledge. The one hope of the world is philosophy, for all the sorrows of modern life result from the lack of a proper philosophic code. Those who sense even in part the dignity of life cannot but realize the shallowness apparent in the activities of this age. Well, has it been said that no individual can succeed until he has developed his philosophy of life. Neither can a race or nation attain true greatness until it has formulated an adequate philosophy and has dedicated its existence to a policy consistent with that philosophy. During the World War, when so called civilization hurled one half of itself against the other in a frenzy of hate, men ruthlessly destroyed something more precious even than human life. They obliterated those records of human thought by which life can be intelligently directionalized. Truly did Muhammad declare the ink of philosophers to be more precious than the blood of martyrs. Priceless documents, invaluable records of achievement, knowledge founded on ages of patient observation and experimentation by the elect of the earth, all were destroyed with scarcely a qualm of regret. What was knowledge? What was truth, beauty, love, idealism, philosophy, or religion when compared to man's desire to control an infinitesimal spot in the fields of cosmos for an inestimably minute fragment of time? Merely to satisfy some whim of or urge of ambition, man would uproot the universe, though well he knows that in a few short years he must depart, leaving all that he has seized to posterity as an old cause for fresh contention. War, the irrefutable evidence of irrationality, still smolders in the hearts of men. It cannot die until human selfishness is overcome. Armed with multifarious inventions and destructive agencies, civilization continue its fratricidal strife through future ages. But upon the mind of man there is dawning a great fear, the fear that eventually civilization will destroy itself in one great cataclysmic struggle. Then must be reenacted the eternal drama of reconstruction. Out of the ruins of the civilization which died when its idealism died, some primitive people yet in the womb of destiny must build a new world. Foreseeing the needs of that day, the philosophers of the ages have desired that into the structure of this new world shall be incorporated the truest and finest of all that has gone before. It is a divine law that the sum of previous accomplishments shall be the foundation of each new order of things. The great philosophic treasures of humanity must be preserved. That which is superficial may be allowed to perish. That which is fundamental and essential must remain, regardless of cost. The entrance to the house of the mysteries. This symbolic figure representing the way to everlasting life, is described by Coonroth in Substance as follows. This is the portal of the amphitheater of the only true and eternal wisdom, a narrow one indeed, but sufficiently august and consecrated to Jehovah. To this portal, ascent is made by a mystic, indisputably prologetic flight of steps set before it as shown in the picture. It consists of 7 theosophic, or rather philosophic, steps of the doctrine of the faithful sons. After ascending the steps, the path is along the way of God the Father, either directly by inspiration or by various mediate means. According to the 7 oracular laws shining at the portal, those who are inspired divinely have the power to enter, and with the eyes of the body and of the mind, of seeing, contemplating, and investigating in a Christiano-Kabbalistic, divino-magical, physico-chemical manner, the nature of the wisdom, goodness, and power of the Creator, to the end that they die not sophistically, but live theosophically, and that the orthodox philosophers so created may with sincere philosophy expound the works of the Lord and worthily praise God, who has thus blessed these friends of God. The above figure and description constitute one of the most remarkable expositions ever made of the appearance of the wise man's house and the way by which it must be entered. 2 fundamental forms of ignorance were recognized by the Platonists: simple ignorance and complex ignorance. Simple ignorance is merely lack of knowledge and is common to all creatures existing posterior to the first cause, which alone has perfection of knowledge. Simple ignorance is an ever active agent urging the soul onward to the acquisition of knowledge. From this virginal state of unawareness grows the desire to become aware, with its resultant improvement in the mental condition. The human intellect is ever surrounded by forms of existence beyond the estimation of its partly developed faculties. In this realm of objects not understood is a never failing source of mental stimuli. Thus, wisdom eventually results from the effort to cope rationally with the problem of the unknown. In the last analysis, the ultimate cause alone can be denominated wise. In simpler words, only God is good. Socrates declared knowledge, virtue, and utility to be one with the innate nature of good. Knowledge is a condition of knowing, virtue a condition of being, utility a condition of doing. Considering wisdom as synonymous with mental completeness, it is evident that such a state can exist only in the whole, for that which is less than the whole cannot possess the fullness of the all. No part of creation is complete, hence, each part is imperfect to the extent that it falls short of entirety. Where incompleteness is, it also follows that ignorance must be coexistent, for every part, while capable of knowing its own self, cannot become aware of the self in the other parts. Philosophically considered, growth from the standpoint of human evolution is a process proceeding from heterogeneity to homogeneity. In time, therefore, the isolated consciousness of the individual fragments is reunited to become the complete consciousness of the whole. Then and then only is the condition of all knowing an absolute reality. Thus, all creatures are relatively ignorant yet relatively wise, comparatively nothing yet comparatively all. The microscope reveals to man his significance, the telescope his insignificance. Through the eternities of existence, man is gradually increasing in both wisdom and understanding. His ever expanding consciousness is including more of the external within the area of itself. Even in man's present state of imperfection, it is dawning upon his realization that he can never be truly happy until he is perfect, and that of all the faculties contributing to his self perfection, none is equal importance to the rational intellect. Through the labyrinth of diversity, only the illumined mind can and must lead the soul into the perfect light of unity. In addition to the simple ignorance, which is the most potent factor in mental growth, there exists another, which is of a far more dangerous and subtle type. This second form, called twofold or complex ignorance, may be briefly defined as ignorance of ignorance. Worshipping the sun, moon, and stars, and offering sacrifices to the winds, the primitive savage sought with crude fetishes to propitiate his unknown gods. He dwelt in a world filled with wonders which he did not understand. Now great cities stand where once roamed the crook-boned men. Humanity no longer regards itself as primitive or aboriginal. The spirit of wonder and awe has been succeeded by one of sophistication. Today, man worships his own accomplishments and either relegates the immensities of time and space to the background of his consciousness or disregards them entirely. The 20th century makes a fetish of civilization and is overwhelmed by its own fabrications. Its gods are of its own fashioning. Humanity has forgotten how infinitesimal, how impermanent, and how ignorant it actually is. Ptolemy has been ridiculed for conceiving the earth to be the center of the universe, yet modern civilization is seemingly founded upon the hypothesis that the planet Earth is the most permanent and important of all the heavenly spheres, and that the gods from their starry thrones are fascinated by the monumental and epochal events taking place upon the spherical anthill in chaos. From age to age, men ceaselessly toil to build cities that they may rule over them with pomp and power, as though a fillet of gold or 10 million vassals could elevate man above the dignity of his own thoughts and make the glitter of his scepter visible to the distant stars. As this tiny planet rolls along its orbit in space, it carries with it some 2 billion human beings who live and die oblivious to that immeasurable existence lying beyond the lump on which they dwell. Measured by the infinities of time and space, what are the captains of industry or the lords of finance? If one of these plutocrats should rise until he ruled the earth itself, what would he be but a petty despot seated on a grain of cosmic dust? Philosophy reveals to man his kinship with the all. It shows him that he is a brother to the suns which dot the firmament. It lifts him from a taxpayer on a whirling atom to a citizen of cosmos. It teaches him that while physically bound to earth, of which his blood and bones are part, there is nevertheless within him a spiritual power, a diviner self, through which he is one with the symphony of the whole. Ignorance of ignorance, then, is that self satisfied state of unawareness in which man, knowing nothing outside the limited area of his physical senses, bumptiously declares there is nothing more to know. He who knows no life save the physical is merely ignorant, but he who declares physical life to be all important and elevates it to the position of supreme reality, such a one is ignorant of his own ignorance. If the infinite had not desired man to become wise, he would not have bestowed upon him the faculty of knowing. If he had not intended man to become virtuous, he would not have sown within the human heart the seeds of virtue. If he had predestined man to be limited to his narrow physical life, he would not have equipped him with perceptions and sensibilities capable of grasping, in part at least, the immensity of the outer universe. The criers of philosophy call all men to a comradeship of the spirit, to a fraternity of thought, to a convocation of selves. Philosophy invites man of the vainness of selfishness, out of the sorrow of ignorance and the despair of worldliness, out of the travesty of ambition and the cruel clutches of greed, out of the red hell of hate and the cold tomb of dead idealism. Philosophy would lead all men into the broad, calm vistas of truth. For the world of philosophy is a land of peace where those finer qualities pent up within each human soul are given opportunity for expression. Here, men are taught the wonders of the blades of grass. Each stick and stone is endowed with speech and tells the secret of its being. All life, bathed in the radiance of understanding, becomes a wonderful and beautiful reality. From the four corners of creation swells a mighty anthem of rejoicing. For here in the light of philosophy is revealed the purpose of existence. The wisdom and goodness permeating the whole become evident to even man's imperfect intellect. Here, the yearning heart of humanity finds that companionship which draws forth from the innermost recesses of the soul that great store of good which lies there like precious metal in some deep hidden vein. Following the path pointed out by the wise, the seeker after truth ultimately attains to the summit of wisdom's mount and gazing down beholds the panorama of life spread out before him. The cities of the plains are but tiny specks, and the horizon on every hand is obscured by the gray haze of the unknown. Then the soul realizes that wisdom lies in breadth of vision, that it increases in comparison to the vista. Then, as man's thoughts lift him heavenward, streets are lost in cities, cities in nations, nations in continents, continents in the earth in space, and space in an infinite eternity, until at last but two things remain: the self and the goodness of God. While man's physical body resides with him and mingles with the heedless throng, it is difficult to conceive of man as actually inhabiting a world of his own, a world which he has discovered by lifting himself into communion with the profundities of his own internal nature. Man may live two lives. One is a struggle from the womb to the tomb. Its span is measured by man's own creation, time. Well may it be called the unheeding well may it be called the unheeding life. The other life is from realization to infinity. It begins with understanding, its duration is forever, and upon the plane of eternity it is consummated. This is called the philosophic life. Philosophers are nor born nor do they die, for once having achieved the realization of immortality, they are immortal. Having once communed with self, they realize that within them there is an immortal foundation that will not pass away. Upon this living, vibrant base, self, they erect a civilization which will endure after the sun, the moon, and the stars have ceased to be. The fool lives but for today, the philosopher lives forever. When once the rational consciousness of man rolls away the stone and comes forth from its sepulchre, it dies no more. For to this second or philosophic birth there is no dissolution. By this should not be inferred physical immortality, but rather that the philosopher has learned that his physical body is no more his true self than the physical earth is his true world. In the realization that he and his body are dissimilar, that though the form must perish, the life will not fail, he achieves conscious immortality. This was the immortality to which Socrates referred when he said, Anytus and Meletus may indeed put me to death, but they cannot injure me. To the wise, physical existence is but the outer room of the hall of life. Swinging open the doors of this antechamber, the illumined pass into the greater and more perfect existence. The ignorant dwell in a world bounded by time and space. To those, however, who grasp the import and dignity of being, these are but phantom shapes, illusions of the senses, arbitrary limits imposed by man's ignorance upon the duration of deity. The philosopher lives and thrills with the realization of this duration, for to him this infinite period has been designed by the all-wise cause as the time of all accomplishment. Man is not the insignificant creature that he appears to be. His physical body is not the true measure of his real self. The invisible nature of man is as vast as his comprehension and as measureless as his thoughts. The fingers of his mind reach out and grasp the stars. His spirit mingles with the throbbing life of cosmos itself. He who has attained to the state of understanding thereby has so increased his capacity to know that he gradually incorporates within himself the various elements of the universe. The unknown is merely that which is yet to be included within the consciousness of the seeker. Philosophy assists man to develop the sense of appreciation, for as it reveals the glory and the sufficiency of knowledge, it also unfolds those latent powers and faculties whereby man is enabled to master the secrets of the seven spheres. From the world of physical pursuits, the initiates of old called their disciples into the life of the mind and the spirit. Throughout the ages, the mysteries have stood at the threshold of reality, that hypothetical spot between noumenon and phenomenon, the substance and the shadow. The gates of the mystery stand ever ajar, and those who will may pass through into the spacious domicile of spirit. The world of philosophy lies neither to the right nor to the left, neither above nor below. Like a subtle essence permeating all space and all substance, it is everywhere. It penetrates the innermost and the outermost parts of all being. In every man and woman, these two spheres are connected by a gate which leads from the not self and its concerns to the self and its realizations. In the mystic, this gate is the heart, and through spiritualization of his emotions, he contacts that more elevated plane which, once felt and known, becomes the sum of the worthwhile. In the philosopher, reason is the gate between the outer and the inner worlds, the illumined mind bridging the chasm between the corporeal and the incorporeal. Thus, godhood is born within the one who sees, and from the concerns of men, he rises to the concerns of gods. In this era of practical things, men ridicule even the existence of God. They scoff at goodness while they ponder with befuddled minds the phantasmagoria of materiality. They have forgotten the path which leads beyond the stars. The great mystical institutions of antiquity, which invited man to enter into his divine inheritance, have crumbled, and institutions of human scheming now stand where once the ancient houses of learning rose a mystery of fluted columns and polished marble. The white robed sages who gave to the world its ideals of culture and beauty have gathered their robes about them and departed from the sight of men. Nevertheless, this little earth is bathed as of old in the sunlight of its providential generator. Wide-eyed babes still face the mysteries of physical existence. Men continue to laugh and cry, to love and hate. Some still dream of a nobler world, a fuller life, a more perfect realization. In both the heart and mind of man, the gates which lead from morality to mortality to immortality are still ajar. Virtue, love, and idealism are yet the regenerators of humanity. God continues to love and guide the destinies of his creation. The path still winds upward to accomplishment. The soul of man has not been deprived of its wings, they are merely folded under its garment of flesh. Philosophy is ever that magic power which, sundering the vessel of clay, releases the soul from its bondage to habit and perversion. Still, as of old, the soul released can spread its wings and soar to the very source of itself. The criers of the mysteries speak again, bidding all men welcome to the house of light. The great institution of materiality has failed. The false civilization built by man has turned and, like the monster of Frankenstein, is destroying its creator. Religion wanders aimlessly in the maze of theological speculation. Science batters itself impotently against the barriers of the unknown. Only transcendental philosophy knows the path. Only the illumined reason can carry the understanding part of man upward to the light. Only philosophy can teach man to be born well, to live well, to die well, and in perfect measure be born again. Into this band of the elect, those who have chosen the life of knowledge, of virtue, and of utility, the philosophers of the ages invite you. And that is the end of this book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. Thank you all for reading with me. Again, if you would like to purchase the book for yourself, it is in the description box. Thanks again. See you all later. Peace.